Hello, welcome to Country Stitchers. I'm Liz. Let's start a project. We have many viewers who have contacted Deb and I at Country Stitchers and mentioned that they're either returning to stitching after a long hiatus or they're trying it for the first time. As I thought about that, it occurred to me that maybe just starting a project with you might be beneficial. Might refresh your memory if you're returning. It might teach you a few things about the start of a project that you didn't know if you're new to this tremendous craft industry called needlework. So I'm going to take some time here and start a project with you. You need some basics to support your effort. A pair of scissors. And it can be any small pair of scissors. You could use a large pair of fabric scissors if you have it. Just something to snip your threads. I picked up this lanyard a long time ago from Keepsake's catalog because I was forever saying, has anybody seen my scissors? And I thought it was funny. They usually were alongside of me in my recliner when I couldn't find them. But this way, I didn't lose them anymore. So a scissors, a highlighter, to mark your progress on the graph, and I'll show you that shortly. I keep a pencil available just to take notes. And then you'll need your needle, which if you are buying a kit, generally comes with the kit. And a generic needle for a standard project is a size 24. That's usually what most people use when they're stitching on a 14 count Aida or a 28 count linen. And that's the project we're going to be starting here today. As I thought about this, I thought maybe if I was starting for the first time, I might just go pick up a kit. It has everything in it. I don't have to worry about buying threads and fabric separately. It's a one-stop. So I went to the thrift store and I walked into our local thrift store in Willow Street. And I got a kit for $1.50. It was a dimensions kit. Deck the Halls with Holly. And it was originally priced for $3 through AC Moore, the original tag. I paid $1.50 for it. And it comes with everything you need to start and finish the project. And by that I mean the stitching of the project. It gives you instructions for how you might mount it in a hoop or prepare it for a hoop mounting at the end. But there was no hoop included with the project. The fabric that came with that kit was a small piece of 14 count black Aida. The threads are already sorted and mounted on a key card. And that has the color and the symbol number on the floss card for you. They're going to show up all those threads real nicely on that black. And it's a yard or more long, each of those threads. So that's a lot of thread. Came with a kit, cellophane wrapper in the needle. Came with a piece of felt to tuck your needle and thread into when you're not currently stitching your project. And then the most important part is the instructions and the graph. And dimensions puts a good deal of time into their instructions. And this is the face page of their instructions. Inside is the graph, the key, and on the back are finishing instructions. So for $1.50, I could have been starting this project with you tonight. Now, because this project is copyrighted and we're not all working on the same project, I'm going to use a pattern that I downloaded from a website, and it's a free pattern, so I can show you that pattern while we stitch. And you can go out and download that pattern at another time if you'd like to stitch it yourself. And there are more patterns out there. It's from Brooks Books, country.stitchers.com, and it's under the freebies section. It's an Advent ornament series where she did 25 animals, one for each day. She named them all, and each one of them makes a small ornament. Before I show that to you, and before we start the project for tonight, I also want to show you that I tend to preload my needles, and today's not an exception because I want to be able to move right through the stitching with you. So I take my needle, I preload the colors for the section I'm going to be working on. So there's a pin cushion next to me. You may see it when I rotate the camera. And I've got 4 needles threaded, 1 waiting to be threaded because I want to be able to show you a simple technique for doing that with DMC. And then I have my piece of fabric for my project. I've marked the center of my fabric, and you might want to do that. You find your center very simply by folding the fabric in one direction and giving a slight pinch, and it'll make a slight mark on your fabric. Do the same thing the other direction. Make another pinch. And when you open it up, that section where both of those little pinches that you did, where they intersect, that's the center of your fabric. And that's generally a solid enough estimation of where the center is that you're not going to get yourself in trouble. If you're off a stitch or two, it's not a problem. I take my floss, and for this project, we're going to be doing a little section on the graph that I'm stitching that has roughly 10 colors in it. And I will show you that section on my Katie Kitty pattern is going to be this section right here. I'm going to start up in this upper left corner. And so I've looked at the symbols, and I've chosen the threads for those symbols and preloaded the needles. And this is the section I'll work through with you now. I like to have my floss organized so I can get to it easily. And I just want to show you a simple little trick. I went to a craft store into their wood section a long time ago, and I picked up a handful of these little rulers they have back there. And these I got at AC Moore. Gosh, this is 2010, I think it was. So I've had them quite a while. And you can write right on the ruler with pencil. And so I just loop my threads around the ruler and write the floss number next to it. And then I can very easily just take my thread off of here. If I was going to be doing something that I was going to be taking in and out of a project bag often, carrying it around, moving it from here and there, I'd want to use one that was punched with a hole, either a wooden floss card or strip, if you will. They sell them in wood like this, and you just write on them. Or even a low-ran like project card that had the holes and lines for the numbers. Sometimes they even have a little magnet on them to hold your needle. So I would just affix these a little bit more sturdily. Even an index card and a paper punch is what I use sometimes just to put my threads on a card all together. Ready to go? I am. I'm going to move the camera, tilt the angle down a little bit, and we'll start our project. I showed you Katie Kitty. This is her. She's done in This is a home computer printout, so the colors aren't real true. I think I showed you the palette in that upper left corner. These are the colors that you're going to see. So it's a little pinker. I must have been missing a base color somewhere, I guess. Or all the patterns were printed in 3 colors. And this is the key. The key gives you your symbol that matches to the location on the chart. So for instance, let's look for the symbol of a spade from a deck of cards. That color they call pine needles in Dragon Floss or Dragonfly Lotus. Hand spun silk, but we're not using that. We're using DMC. And this is the DMC equivalent. And it's 700. So I've pulled this color and these other colors. And this is going to be the first color that we start with right up here on our pattern. And we're going to stitch down here. We'll skip the other symbol. We'll continue with those. And when we get to here, we're going to pick up another color and work our way through. So, how do we find this place to stitch? We're going to use the center point, which on a printed pattern, you use the arrow at the side. It can be on the right or the left, and then the one in the center, and it can be at the top or the bottom. You come together, and then you count the number of stitches up and over to where you're going to start. So in this case, my center is 2 stitches up from this boulder line, and I'm going to go up 10, 20. These are each in grids of 10. So I'm going to go up 10, 20, and then one more. So I'm going to go up 21 stitches, and I'm going to go left 10, 11, 12, 13. So I'm going to go up, and again we're going up 10, 20, 2, and left 13. And that'll be where I place my first stitch. We're doing that just so that you can have a point of reference. You can also start by knowing what margin you want to start with outside of your piece and make that the point at which you start counting from. But for this purpose, let's do it this way. We're going to count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and that's rough enough. So there I've counted up from my center 22 stitches, and I'm going to go left 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. And again, this fabric is plenty large enough that I don't have to worry about being off a stitch or two. So now you can pretty much see how large this is going to be when I'm done. This was my center right here. So it'll only go as high as this across. And then it'll be about that big. So it's not a really large design. And the first color I said was pine needle green. So I'm going to take that out of my pin cushion. And I'm going to come up right where I marked it. I come up from the bottom. Now, I told you I had one thread that I hadn't loaded. And let me show you why I left a thread unloaded. I'm going to show you need to strand your thread. Most stranded cotton comes 6 strands to a skein. So you remove one strand, you blossom out the end, remove your strand simply. You can hold it and slide it right through. it helps to kind of straighten out the bottom every now and then. So I've pulled through one strand of white. Now, this is approximately a yard long, and that's a little longer than I want to stitch with. I would suggest that we fold this in half and cut it. So I'm going to do just that before we load our needle. And the reason, I don't have a large section of this color to do, so I don't want to put that much thread on it. So I'm going to keep this one strand a little shorter than the other ones I loaded. Now I take the thread that I'm going to be using, and I'm going to fold that thread in half, leaving a loop at one end, and both loose ends will be together. So that's my folded thread. And then I thread my needle with the loop, just like that. And I pull that through, leaving a tail about 3 inches long, 3 to 4 inches. You don't want it to come too close to the end of your loop. You don't want to stitch it into your fabric, and you'll see what I mean as we go. But that's how you thread it. Now, the reason I showed you this at this point is because this loop becomes important to our first stitch, because we're going to use it to anchor our thread to our fabric. So with that in mind, let's pick that green needle and thread up, which is right at the stitch that we're going to start with. I have not pulled it all the way through. I've left a generous tail on the back. So now I make my first half stitch by going from the bottom left to the top right of that first square. On the back then, I pull that thread through. I draw that tail up a little bit. You can see there, I shorten that tail. Then that loop that we just looked at, I'll lay it down here where you can see it. We just looked at this when we loaded the white thread. Now I'm going to slip my needle inside that loop and bring it through, and you'll see that I'm going to attach my thread now basically to my fabric the same way I have it attached to that little ruler. I just made a little lark knot, I think it's called, or half lark. Anyway, that's my anchoring to my fabric. So the first half of the stitch is on the front. My thread is anchored. Now we're going to look at the graph, and you'll see that the first 3 stitches I'm going to make are that same color. The Danish style of stitching is to start with your first half stitch, stitch the first half across the row in the same color, then return and close those stitches with the second half of the stitch going back. Then you drop to your next row and you do the same thing back and forth. The English method of stitching is to complete each stitch as you go. And that's become a very popular form of stitching in the United States now because of the over-dyed flosses, which is not a basic tool to talk about, but just to let you know, though, there are 2 ways of stitching. You can either complete your stitch and move to the next one, or you can stitch half the stitch and come back and finish the other half, drop down, go back and forth. If you stitch each one, you would more than likely go across the row, drop down, then stitch back across that row, drop down, stitch back across that row. So I'm going to go the first pass, half stitches. So now I come up under where I just went down, directly under. So we're only concerned about 2 rows of stitching two sets of holes, if you will. This one on the top of that intersection of threads. This is Ada, so there's threads that comprise the top or the horizontal and the vertical threads that overlap each one in the square there. The next one, again, I go down through the upper right hand corner. And after I complete this row, I'm going to show you another technique that you might choose. And that's the first row for our 3 green stitches. Now we're going to come back that's the first completed stitch. Again, you're always coming up directly under where you go down. And you're always going from a bottom to a top corner. And after you've completed these 3, we're going to do the next row. Now, I stitch using what's called the sewing method most of the time. And I'm going to do this next row using that method. There are also people who stitch using a hoop. I tend to hold my fabric in my hand when I stitch, unless it's a very large piece, and then I'll use a Q-snap or a small frame or a hoop. Now, we're going to go in the same hole, but instead of going all the way through and pulling it from the back, I'm going to tilt my needle, and I'm going to bring my needle up in the place that I would be exiting from the back as I come forward. So I've just taken a stitch across the top of my fabric without having to turn the fabric over or release my needle. Again, the next stitch, I guess I actually do release my needle at one point to pull it through. That's the second half stitch. And the third. And now I go back the same way I came across. And the other thing is, the more gently you stitch and sew, the less likely you'll have knotting. It's a slow, gentle process of drawing your thread through there and creating your stitches. It's very methodical, very relaxing, and watching your piece appear before you on your fabric is very creative, and it gives you a real sense of accomplishment as your image starts to transfer from the graph to your fabric and becomes colored. It's very, very satisfying. Now the last row on this side, let's mark what we've done. I've stitched those 3 and those 3. So I have the first 2 rows completed. This next row has 5 stitches, and then I'll come back, and then we'll move down here, and then we'll do these 3 and these 3. This row, this row, this row. And then I'm going to close out the thread for now. And we're going to come back up and look at adding this color in here. And we'll see where else we move to from that point. But for now, the next row is 5. How's yours coming? Did you get your first row done? Why don't you stop and start your... I came up here, finishing my sewing method, I should have actually come up one below that to do my next row. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody. I was thinking about my next discussion point and I wasn't paying attention. So now I'm going to stitch 5 stitches, and I'll go back and use the other method for those of you who prefer to go front to back. I started to say, if you're working on yours, don't be afraid to pause this and do the part that I'm doing, you know, the stitching, and turn it back on until you've made a few stitches and see how yours is progressing. And if you're stitching the same thing I am, that would work out really well. But if you have your own kit, it is literally as simple as knowing how to make the X's and knowing how to change a color. Because when you can do that, there is no pattern that is too big to stitch. And I want to share a story with you about another floss tuber that I started watching when she did her first video. She's in England. Her name is Teresa Little Stitcher. She goes by on her channel. But she was off work with disability, which has been my condition now for almost 20 years. And I'm permanently disabled, but I have always enjoyed needlework and have been very grateful to have it. So I was interested in listening to how she came to learn about stitching. And she found a pattern that she really liked. She was too new to know that when you did something that they call full coverage, which means every space on your fabric gets stitched, that there's nothing open, is a fairly daunting project for most people. And so she picked one out as her first project. And her friend told her, if you can make an X, you can stitch anything. And what a friend to have, boy, because she picked up that first piece. She started it and finished it and had it framed, and she just did a phenomenal job learning how to cross stitch and applying her stitching knowledge to that piece. So, no project too big if you know how to make an X. The thing I like about Brooks Books designs for the most part is that her pieces are done for perforated paper, which is another medium you can stitch on. And so they don't have a lot of partial stitches or specialty stitches. And that makes it a little more simple as a first project. So now our next row starts under the 3rd stitch of our last row. So I'm going to move over to there and come up underneath the beginning of that 3rd stitch. So 1, 2, 3, and that's where I'm going to start. And on this row, according to my pattern, I'm going to be stitching 3 more. So I'm going to go to the end here. And maybe I'll put these in the sewing method for those of you who might like to see that revisited. And there are other techniques to use in conjunction with what I'm doing. But again, what we want to teach here is the basic cross stitch. And as I add videos and Deb adds videos to our library, we'll talk about other techniques and other things that you might add to your knowledge base for this craft. I can't even imagine not liking this if somebody tries it. But I know there are people, like my twin sister. She runs from a needle. She used to buy my mother patterns and say, stitch this for me, Mom. I used to think, why isn't Mom stitching something for me? Mom was no dummy. She knew I stitched. She wasn't going to do mine for me. So she did actually give me a beautiful piece for my 50th birthday. Sometime I'll show that. But here we go. Let's look at where we've progressed. We finished this row and this row. Now, if I wanted to do this journey, I could have just skipped this empty stitch and gone over here and done those 3, picked up these 2, and come back. Might have even picked these up and done those, but I'm choosing to make this very simple and follow this all the way down to the bottom for you. So now we're going to do 2 more rows of 3, and then we're going to do this row of 5 and this 2 rows of 3 in this same color. Then we'll move on to a new color. So let's do the next row of 3, which starts 1 to the left of this last row. One. If you find you enjoy stitching and you have a period to stitch in the daytime that's quiet and personal time. I had someone in a guild that I was in tell me once that they stitched all of their half stitches one direction when they were stitching by themselves and reading the pattern. And then at night when the family was there and they were watching TV together, she went back and did all the other half crosses to complete the stitches, and that way she didn't have to count and focus on the pattern. She just had to finish what she'd already mapped out on her fabric. And I thought, wow, what a neat way to use all the time that you have productively. Take advantage of that quiet time to get things started and then continue when things are a little more unfocused on something you've already mapped out. I personally just waited to stitch until my children were in bed at night. That was my downtime after a long day at work, and it was really, really calming and relaxing to me after a long day at work. And I was a single mom with 2 kids, and it was just pleasant. Even when they were little and I was married at the time, it was still time that I waited till they were in bed to stitch. So now I've got those 2 rows of 3, and now my next row starts 2 more stitches to the left of that last row. So now I'm going to come over 2 more to the left, and I stitch 5 here. Let me show you where we are on the pattern. This is probably the important part, is to keep your key and pattern up to date with your stitching. So this next one is over here, 2 stitches to the left, and I'm going to go 5, which ends at the end of that last row. Check your tail. Make sure that your tail isn't too close to your stitching, because once you've stitched that tail in on accident, it can be kind of a bear. You have to pull it out and loosen it up to get it free. It does happen. I do it. So now I use the stitching method here. I'm going to go across, and I have to stitch 5 stitches. Third half, fourth half, and the last half. And now I'm going to come back on that. One. You want to be cautious to keep your stitches looking uniform. When you come out or come up from the back, make sure that you're going through the hole and not through previous stitching. You don't want to split your threads or split the threads that you're coming through. Your needles are blunt on a tapestry needle like this, so that you can have a little play when you bring the needle up and it doesn't just grab the fabric. And my last stitch in that row 5. Now, before we do the last 2 rows of 3, and I'm going to come up at the beginning there because that's where our next stitch is going to be. Before I do these, first I'll mark off that row of 5. But then I'm going to show you, before we go too much farther, if you want to try using a hoop in your project, these plastic hoops that have a ridge on them work really well. I'm going to show you that laying your fabric down upside down on your hoop, put the ridge to the bottom, lay that upside down, make sure you don't have your thread caught between your fabric and the hoop, and then you just press this down. I try to make sure that I keep my hardware directly at the top so that I'm not pulling my thread over it and snagging on that. But put that down flush against the back and then just tighten it up. Now, what I'm going to show you, the reason I do it this way, on this ornament, it may not be an issue, but some things you're going to stitch in your hoop, you're going to go pretty close to the edge. Stitching from the top, not a problem. That's not the concern of using the hoop in this orientation. The reason for it is when you get through to the back, if you're close to the edge, I'm going to do half a stitch here, invert it. If you're about to tie off or anchor your thread, which involves sliding your thread under the stitches, and your fabric is in the other direction, when you turn it over, you can't get your needle through and pulled through if you're near an edge when you have it in so that this is the back. By doing it this way, no matter how close to the edge you are, you can get to those stitches to anchor your threads on the sides. So, again, on this, where it's a small ornament in the center, not nearly as impacting, but just a tip should you start doing anything that's a little larger. So now, we're going to do the last 2 sets of 3. And I want to show you that if you leave your fabric a little bit loose in the hoop, you can still do a sewing method with a hoop. You don't have to stitch in hand to use a sewing method. I find it to be a much quicker way to stitch. But I did not start out this way. I think I'd been stitching maybe 20, might even be 20, yeah, probably 20 years before I saw someone doing it this way. And again, I came up in that row. I really want to come up in the one under that for my next row. So, last 3 stitches on this side, and then we'll walk through anchoring our thread and starting a new one. That is all after this transition to another needle that anybody needs to know to do a project, really. Sorry about the camera moving. That is the leaves in Katie Kitty's hair on the holly. And now what we're going to do is anchor our thread on the back. Those were the last 2 rows that we stitched. I take my needle and I run it under the backs. And I don't go into the fabric, just under the thread of the stitch. And then I pull it through. And you don't have to go through more than 3-4 stitches. And you snip your thread off close to your fabric. And that's my first color. Now, let's see what it says our next color will be. And what we're going to do is go to the color that we would encounter the next part of the pattern, which in this case, I'm going to go to this half circle symbol, and we will stitch these 2 stitches, then we'll go across and stitch those, then we'll do these 3, these 4, pick up that one, and do those. We could also, if we wanted to, stitch down. We get to here, stitch over and down, pick those up. But I mean, you can see this goes the whole way across. The rule of thumb when you're stitching, don't carry your thread more than 2 or 3 stitches across the back of your fabric if you have an open surface above them. So in this case, I've got other stitches. I could go ahead and carry my thread over to all of these if I wanted to, because these stitches are going to be laid down on top of it. The open transfer would be, let's say I was stitched here and wanted to come across and do these 2. That would be okay if you go across a couple of open stitches. You don't want to have your thread long. You wouldn't want to leave here and pick up a stitch over here without ending your thread, because it's really easy to snag those threads on the back of your piece, and it also can be seen sometimes behind this open work if it's a darker color once you finish your piece. So I'm sure there are other reasons people don't do it, but those were the 2 foremost in my mind. Let's go ahead and pick that color up. We'll check the chart just so we refresh your memory on how to do that. We're looking for this symbol. That's called Sunstone if you're using Dragonfly Lotus silk. But the DMC color is 977. On our ruler, 977, we have 996. Just slide these down where they live. So 977 is this light, they call it sandstone. No, I'm sorry. I'm down one. Let me slide these the other way. I have my numbers grouped a little loose there. That's 951. 977 is this color right here. Now, I've already pulled it. I already have my needle loaded. So, just to refresh your memory, we left a loop. We pulled it through when we loaded our thread. And if you need to refresh your memory, go back to where I showed you with the white thread. And now we're going to start with the first stitch, which is right next to the second row of 5. This is our first row of 5. Second row of 5, this stitch right here is going to be the first one we do using that color. And I'm going to walk you through some of this color, and then we're going to continue stitching separately. And I hope you enjoy your new project start, whether it's something you're going back to or a new piece or kit you've picked up. Okay, so there's the first half of the stitch. And if we look at this pattern, as I recall, we have to travel a little bit here. We've got this stitch. I'm going to skip 2, do another one, skip 1, do another one, skip 2, come to here. Then I'm going to travel up and back and come across. And I will have taken care of these 3 and traveled back here, and then I'll be able to go across and back on each of these rows, picking up all those symbols as we go. And I'll stop here. So we have 1, skip 2, 1, skip 1, 1. We'll go back and look next time. So 1, skip 2, 1, skip 1, 1 and skip 2. And then this is where we're going to start moving up. So let's double check that pattern so we're all on the same page here with how we're interpreting this. I'm going to get my highlighter. So I did 1. And that's this one right here. Then I skipped 2 stitches. And I did another one. Then I skipped 1 stitch, did another one. I skipped 2 and placed that one. Now at an angle, I'm going to travel up and do 3 half stitches, travel back on those 3, and stop down here after I complete this stitch at the end of this row. Okay, so to travel like that, you sometimes have to go up to the last stitch. In this case, I only am traveling 3 stitches. That's the farthest stitch I have to create. And I'm going to do these one at a time coming back down. And it just makes this simple. When you're starting out, if you leave a longer thread on the back than other people do, or you come back and pick up a stitch that you forgot, whatever it is that you're doing, just enjoy learning how to cross stitch. You'll decide what you want to do and how far you want to go with your thread and what your stitching looks like and what your stitch tension looks like, and it'll be your preference and it's your piece. So there's really no hard and fast rule. I have a tendency to make my stitches tighter. Some people leave their stitches looser. So now I'm back at that last stitch at the end of the row. Now, this knot that just occurred is something that happens from time to time, and before you get too rough with it, you saw that that drew together in that little knot as I pulled through. If you take your needle and gently pull the bottom under that knot, it comes out. So just a tip, it is very easy to open that knot up if you catch it early. So now, you watched me, whoops, jumped right out of my hand. You watched me travel up, and I started at the top here. I did this stitch, then came back down doing those, and now I finished that one. Now I'm going to go back, put the cross on those, and then I'll work this direction here. And I'm going to move away from the camera just a little bit so I can sit while I stitch this. I'm going to come back. Pick up these stitches. And my next row on this pattern for that color, revisit it, starts 2 stitches to the left of that very first stitch. So I'm going to go 2 to the left, and that's just adjacent to that green that I stopped at. Now I can stitch the next 3. I taught my grandson, I might have said this already, how to stitch when he was 5. And I taught him just to stitch his name on a bookmark. And I think he did it in backstitch even, just, you know, making stitches as he saw it with his needle and thread. I didn't even confound him with the idea of making an X in all the little squares. But he was so proud of that little bookmark when he was done. Took it home and gave it to his mom and dad to put on the refrigerator. And after that, I would do things and do them on t-shirts for him when he went into school. And I remember somebody teasing me about my stitching one time over at his house. And he defended his mom's honor. He said, "Don't tease Mom. She makes beautiful things for people with her needle and thread." I was so touched. I thought, well, even if you don't stitch, you can have an appreciation for it. So now I'm at the end of that row. It ends after that third one. I'm going to come back. Finish my stitches. Now, that is literally all you need to know to take on a small cross stitch project and finish it. Just keep track of your colors and your symbols. Keep your thread short enough that it doesn't knot quickly on you. Draw your thread through gently and slowly, and it will definitely respond in a nicer way. Now my next row, let's take one look at this again. I just finished this row. My next one starts under the second in from that last row of green that we did. And then I'm going to work across and back. And I'll do these couple of rows. And then we're going to let you work on your own project. That next one starts the second one in. Which is right here. I'm going to stop here for 1 second, change my position, making sure that you can actually see where I am. That's 1 stitch over. Now my pattern goes 1 more. So this row is every other stitch all the way to the second to the last stitch. Now you can see these colors are very different. Whoops. From the, what I did was I came straight up. I forgot we were skipping every other row. The reason I say about the color is that picture definitely has this kitty looking like she's going to be pink and white. And she very clearly is a tabby kitty. And my last stitch on that row. So with this new year starting, you can start a new project. You can start a new craft. All the supplies for something like this can be found in your local craft stores. Check your area and maybe use your Google Maps. Check for cross-stitch store You'll find a wealth of information from the people who work there to help you out if you have a local needlework shop. There is a book and a website called needletravel.com or needleworktravel.com. I'd have to double check. But either way, this particular site, and there's an app in the App Store for it, will actually take your zip code and tell you if there is a shop near you. I'm going to double check this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stitches on that row. 3, 6, every other one. Now the next row, we're going to mark that one we just did. And the next one starts 2 stitches to the left or directly under the last row and last stitch of our green, which is this one. And it helps if you use those other stitches as a basis for comparison of where you are. It just helps to keep you on track. Oh, and then we're going to stitch 4, skip 2, stitch 1 and 1, skip 2, stitch 4. And you can refer to that pattern as often as you like when you go across your rows. I'm going to drag my tail a little bit. So I'm stitching 4. Oops, okay. I just lost a thread out of my needle. I didn't have my finger over it. So now I'm going to just back that out of that half stitch. Looks like I actually got it. Okay, it's all right. I see what happened is I had it not quite even in my needle. So when I pulled it, I pulled the shorter thread through. So what I'm going to do is, let me show you so you can see what I mean. My threads aren't the same length because I somehow shifted it when I loaded my needle. So I'm going to snip that off even with that other thread so they're both the same length. And then when I have my fingers on my tail, it won't slip through again like that because that's what happened. I just pulled it up too high thinking that whole thing was that long. So now we're going 4 stitches. One, 2, 3, 4. Then we skip 2. Now I'm just going to go back here a minute. Get the tension a little wonky there. I don't care for that. Just going to straighten that out a little bit. There we go. That lays a little more evenly. Okay, so now I go skip 1. And every now and then, let your needle dangle behind your thread, or your work, I mean, and let your thread unwind. We have a tendency when we stitch, it happens automatically. We roll our needle slightly, and that puts a slight twist in our thread. And we don't want to twist in our thread because it makes our threads lay funny on the surface. So now I skip 2, and I'm going to stitch 4 more. That ends this row. Okay, now we'll go back across those stitches. If you were watching, you probably saw me twist that needle. I just twist it in the opposite direction of what I normally twist it. Sometimes and unwind it, because I stitch, as you just have been watching, I stitch on the top, so I don't always have my needle loose in the back. If I know it's pretty tight and I need to let it unwind, sometimes I'll just drop it on the back and let it go, like I did when I showed you. So, there we go. And I'm going to conclude after this row. I'm running towards the end of this piece of floss. So I'm going to anchor it, show you that one more time. And then I'm going to let you continue to work on yours. It's fun to stitch and watch floss tube. So I encourage you, there are a lot of floss tube channels, a lot of people showing their stitching. So check out all the ideas and things that are on the channel. Check out our channel if you haven't seen our videos. We have quite a few, as do a lot of other floss tubers. Some of the retail stores have sites where they show patterns that they have in their shops. They show some of the work that they do. It's quite a selection of channels, and also just so much information about needlework. This next row, I started on it just because I realized there's 4 stitches off to the right there. I thought, well, I do have enough here to do that section. Now I'm drawing up close, so I'm going to go back on this 4. Isn't it terrible? A skein of thread is 75 cents, and I still, after all these years, will stitch down to like the last inch of the thread before I anchor it. I have always done that. I don't know. I guess I think I'm being wasteful. Truthfully, it's not that conservative to try to save it. That is so cute. I can see her furrowed brow starting to take shape there at the top with the little green leaf. So I'm going to continue to work on her. And perhaps before long, we'll come back and revisit the project, maybe visit some finishing ideas, and go from there. I've just secured my thread. Oops. I'm going to snip that floss off there at the back of my piece. I hope you had as much fun starting your project. Thank you very much for spending the time with me here on Country Stitchers as we share the joy of needlework. Good night.